Well, good morning, everybody. Mark did not tell you that he told us when he spent 3 nights with us, and he told me he was going to go on a walk to get some exercise. And after about an hour, I went hunting for him, and he managed to find in our city a place with a live band where he was sitting with a group. So I came back and told my wife, "This Mark Anarumo is really cool." So thank you, Mark. Okay. Now, I have a lot to cover today, and I'm going to refer to my notes because there's details that I want to provide. Mark has introduced me. Let me say I did serve 4 terms as a South Carolina state senator, so I have a military, business, legal, and political background, which is an unusual combination. I'm going to talk about a prayer for relief. Now, what is it? It's a 192-page, 1,136 footnote book written by me as a law student at New York University. And what it does is to compare and analyze from a legal standpoint the conduct, honor, and ethics systems of the 5 federal service academies. I researched the origins of the systems, their legal basis, what authority there was for them, requirements, and made recommendations for improvement. How did this come about? Well, I got into NYU Law School in 1970, and after a year was picked to be on the law review. If you're on the law review, you're required to write about a legal topic. And I chose to write about the Air Force Academy's Honor Code. I thought, in my mind, it was going to be a description of how it worked. And I did that because it interested me, but I discovered nothing had been written in the legal literature about it. So the public really didn't know how it worked. And so this description of the Air Force Academy's honor system expanded to a 2.5-year, $18,000 study of all 5 service academies. I went to each academy twice with 2 other people, second time, took tape recorded interviews, spent 3 weeks in the Library of Congress with another Air Force Academy graduate reading everything ever written that we could find about an academy. And to give you an idea of the intensity of this, over one Christmas holiday, as the NYU law students went home before Christmas, I stayed, and when they came back after New Year's, I was still there. So I gave up Christmas to finish this. So, and this is before computers, so there's no word processing. So it was very laborious. Now, after I'd spent more than a year researching this, I filed with 2 other editors of law review a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit. We had asked the Air Force Academy for a copy of the 1-page 2 summaries of all their honor cases with the names deleted. We did not want to know who was involved, but I wanted to be able to show what people had been expelled for. And I did that because I thought in some cases they left for things I considered to be trivial or minutia, and I didn't think people would believe it, so I wanted to document it. And we also wanted documents about attrition. So at the district court level, there was a new Freedom of Information Act. We tested it. The district court gave us the attrition information. On the Second Circuit Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court ruled with us that the honor case summaries had to be turned over with the names deleted. So I kind of stumbled into this where I came to a point where I concluded that there were things that needed to be changed, and they were only going to be changed if they were documented and there was published. So I saw this as a public service. Also, there had been a lot of public interest in this. There had been 3 public cheating scandals at the Air Force Academy in 7 years. 65, 67, 72, the Board of Visitors had criticized the Air Force Academy. Congress actually had in 67 to 68 a special subcommittee, the House Armed Services Committee, that was investigating all 5 academies. So this was a timely topic. Now, what I'm going to go over are 8 changes I believe that were made as a result of a prayer for relief that are beneficial. And then I'm going to go over 10 lessons learned that I see as recommendations for the academies. First of all, let's talk about the Freedom of Information Act case. When the smoke cleared away, it caused no harm whatsoever. It established a precedent of redaction. This was a new Freedom of Information Act, and the precedent was the government could not withhold a document because somebody's name was on it. They had to blacken it out or razor blade it out. In fact, the federal government, that's called the Rose process. And the states adopted Freedom of Information Act themselves, and they have redaction. So when you see on TV redaction, it comes from this case. But also it established that what happens at the academies is public information, including what happens with the conduct, honor, and ethics system, specifically the honor system, is public information except for the names of the people that were involved. Now, one of the areas that I addressed is confrontation. You don't have to be a lawyer to know that in order to get to the truth of the matter, when somebody's accused of something, the accused needs to be present while the evidence is presented, while the witnesses testify. And I found that the law required that, but I found that that was not happening at most of the academies. For example, on page 95, I documented the accused were allowed to enter the hearing room for an honor case only after all other witnesses had testified and all other evidence had been presented at the Coast Guard Academy, West Point Naval Academy, and Merchant Marine Academy. That practice was followed also at the Air Force Academy until October 1965. The accused was not informed of what had been said or done prior to his arriving at an honor hearing, or even told the identity of the witnesses against him at West Point and the Naval Academy. Voting panel members interviewed witnesses outside of the hearing, or they listened to an investigator's report at the hearing before the arrival of the accused at the Merchant Marine Academy, Air Force, Navy Academies at West Point. Other cadets at West Point were allowed to attend the honor hearings and hear all the evidence against the accused before the accused showed up. And the accused did not even know who turned him in unless they picked it up by rumor. And then the attendees from the Cadet Corps were allowed to ask questions. And I have in a letter from a West Point honor chairman that 200 cadets attended as an observer somebody's honor hearing, hearing all the evidence against somebody before the person arrived. So anyway, I saw that as a problem that needed to be changed. If you want to get to the truth, you need to have the accused present while all the evidence is presented so they know what the people making the judgments are thinking or heard. Second thing that Perfect Leaf accomplished, it abolished the silence at West Point. That's written on pages 41 and 42 and 137 through 150 at West Point in a Perfect Leaf. If you don't read anything in Perfect Leaf, you should read the silence part. Now here's how it worked. If an accused cadet was found guilty by the honor committee, he had a right by regulation to appeal to a board of officers. If that board of officers found him not guilty, by regulation, they were allowed to return to the Corps in good standing. However, they didn't really return to the Corps in good standing because the cadets worked to drive him out. They silenced him. And each incoming freshman class was taught that the honor committee makes the final decision, and if somebody stays after the honor committee found him guilty, they're going to be silenced. And when I wrote a prayer for relief, there were two cadets being silenced. One was a first classman, senior, another was a second classman. And here are the penalties imposed on them. A memo from the honor committee at West Point lists 10 things that happen to somebody being silenced. Silence lasts the entire career in the armed forces. Not permitted to wear the class ring. Not allowed roommates. Seats next to the person are vacant in the dining hall. So picture this now. These two cadets being silenced have no roommate. They eat 3 meals a day in a dining hall, sitting at a table by themselves. They were not allowed to participate in the fourth class system. And they reduced in rank. They're not allowed to attend dances, parades, inspections, football games, intramurals. But it was worse than that. The first class cadet being silenced. And the movie was ultimately by him, and he was on 60 Minutes, so that's public. His name's Jim Pelosi. He had committed against him physical assault, mail destroyed, non-delivery messages, not allowed to attend class for 42 days, slide rule broken into pieces and returned to his case jelly put between the sheets, soak the clothing and bed sheets in water, et cetera, et cetera. So in other words, it's vandalism. Broken bottles put under tires of the car. Now, what's wrong with this? Well, first of all, there's a West Point regulation 16.04 I discovered. It says if the officer board finds them not guilty, they're to be returned to the Corps in good standing. Well, they're not being returned in good standing if they don't have a roommate, and all these things are happening to them. And another West Point regulation, 12.09, said all combinations of joint actions among cadets for the purpose of expressing disapprobation or censure of any person or persons in the military are prohibited. Well, that's exactly what the cadets were doing. They were combining or conspiring to express disapproval of somebody to drive them out. And there's also a federal anti-hazing statute, which, by the way, was passed by Congress in the 1800s because a West Point cadet got killed due to hazing. Regulations must be obeyed. The Constitution requires even the military to obey its own regulations, even when discretionary decisions are involved. Now, how could this be allowed to go on at West Point? The father of the second-class cadet being silenced wrote a letter to the Secretary of the Army complaining about his son being violent, Robert Froke. And this Secretary of the Army replied in a letter dated 10/11/72 explaining why the Army wasn't going to stop the silence. He said that, quote, the code is the cadet's own, unquote. Direct control by West Point officials would be incorrect because cadets are volunteer members of the Corps. Quote, they are subject to the unofficial standards of the Corps in addition to the official standards of the Army. They're separate jurisdictions, quote, unquote. And furthermore, for the Army to stop the silence, according to the Secretary of the Army, quote, to do so would be to issue instructions impossible to enforce on the one hand, and which would fly in the face of longstanding tradition on the other. So I asked top officials at West Point, how far do you think you would get away with allowing the silence if it was because somebody was black? What if they didn't have a roommate? Nobody would sit with them on the dining hall. You think you would really be able to excuse that by saying, gee, it's unofficial? This notion that the Cadet Corps or the Honor Committee was a separate jurisdiction is not only wrong, it's absurd. Everything that happens in the Academy is subject to the United States Constitution and statutes and regulations, and there's not a separate jurisdiction where there's unofficial rules that they're going to go by, especially if they're violating West Point's own regulations and a federal anti-hazing statute. In 1964, the Air Force Academy rejected the silence. And I read, quote, due to the mature judgment and wisdom of the Commandant of Cadets. That was Robert Strong. However, the Air Force Academy subscribed to the same notion that the Honor Committee belonged to cadets, officers were not to interfere, and the legal advisor of the Air Force Academy, in an interview tape recorded on 9/2/71, said the Honor Code belongs to cadets. He advises the Honor Committee only on their request, and it's inappropriate for him to intervene on whatever the Honor Committee does. And I swear he said, even if they played cards and throw dice to find somebody guilty. That was all tape recorded. But here's an ideology or a mindset, is that we're not supervising the cadets, it's their code, and whatever they want to do, we'll let them do it. Now, how did the silence end? I got a front page article in the New York Times on June 7th, 1973 about the silence, entitled, Silent Agony Ends for Cadet at West Point. 2 months later, in August, West Point held a press conference announcing the abolition of the silence due to the public outrage once they learned what it was. Also, Pelosi appearing on 60 Minutes. Now, I want to talk about coerced interrogations, pages 113 through 132. The UCMJ has Article 31, which gives, for the lawyers here, most of the Miranda protections years before. But basically it says, nobody, not the highest general, can interrogate the lowest enlisted man in a coercive manner if what they're being interrogating about they could be court-martialed for. So at the Air Force Academy, cadets were told if they were found guilty of violating the Honor Code, that in writing, but also verbally. That's my protection. They were told if you appeal, you could be court-martialed. Superintendent might court-martial you because they could be court-martialed. So, but if you just resign, you won't be court-martialed. But I discovered why I'm writing this NYU Law Review article in just a little dorm room. I received a copy of the Talon magazine, a cadet magazine, with an article called Vindication of the Code. What this described is that in January 19, 1972, the Honor Committee discovered a cheating ring about 10:30 p.m. Between midnight and 6 a.m., they pulled over 100 cadets out of bed. They put them in rooms by themselves, stood them at a brace, screamed at them, threatened with court-martial if they didn't confess. They had 40 hearings in 47 hours and something minutes, 39 convictions. They put them on planes and dispersed them all over the United States. I'm going to read a portion of pages 128, 129. And most of this is from the press conference given by the superintendent, and an article in the AOG magazine, and the article in the Talon, plus a couple of other magazines. By morning, between 75 and 125 suspects have been placed in rooms where they were guarded, forbidden to talk to anyone, including each other, in some cases uninformed for hours as to why they were being held. Each cadet was interrogated, some for as long as 6 hours, by 5 to 12 cadet investigators, some of whom required the cadets to stand at a brace and to answer all questions with "sir." Some accused cadets were held in question throughout the night into the following day, sleeping if they could in chair. The interrogators were hostile and extreme. The suspects were bombarded with questions from all sides. The cadets under suspicion were threatened with court-martial for various offenses, including experimenting with drugs, if they persisted in refusing to answer questions or refusing to sign a confession. The cadets were also threatened with a variety of other reprisals. I'm going to skip a little bit for time. The investigations continued around the clock. In less than 48 hours, 39 cadets were convicted of having violated the Cadet Honor Code. Using information from these convictions, all 39 were separated from the Air Force and serving, in most cases, 2 years. Again, why are we teaching, why do we allow cadets to learn that interrogation process? If in the real military you can't do it, Article 31 of the UCMJ doesn't allow it, the Constitution doesn't allow it. And so this was the real line of demarcation to me, because when I went to Academy officials about this, remember I went to each academy twice, and once they knew this law review article would be written, they wanted to give me their side, which is what I wanted them to do. And they justified this. A lawyer in the law department, and this is all documented, said it really wasn't intimidating to the cadets because they were used to the fourth class system. And since they had been through a whole year of that, the fact they pulled out of bed in the middle of the night and went through this process was basically no big deal to them. Now that was the justification being given to the press by an officer in the law department. Somebody in Washington sent a team out here and they wrote new guidelines for interrogations, and that hasn't happened since. But I want you to know it did happen. And when I had to decide whether to publish this and continue this, I knew it happened, and I knew the silence happened. I knew confrontation happened. I haven't even gotten to the other 4 or 5 things yet. Let's talk about due process. That's the term you hear. That due process means different things in different contexts. And of course, in the military is special, and there's a lot of deference to its needs. But I found certain aspects of the, remember there was a conduct, an honor system at all 5 academies. At Coast Guard and the Air Force Academy, there was also an ethics system. I found that curious. Why do 2 have an ethics system but not the other 3? But I learned that West Point Air Force Academy had an honor code, and Navy Coast Guard Merchant Marine Academy had an honor concept. And there were 2 fundamental differences, and that is expulsion was the only penalty with the honor code. But at Navy Coast Guard Merchant Academy, they had graduated penalties. So you could get, depending on the severity of the offense, demerits or tours or probation. But also there was toleration clause for the honor code. There was no toleration clause at Navy Coast Guard Merchant Academy. Well, as of that time, all the cheating scandals had happened at West Point and the Air Force Academy, and none at the Naval Academy. And in these hearings, the House Armed Services Committee and the General Accounting Office State of the Academies, they put in their report, we wonder why one system is okay at 3 academies, but not at the other 2 academies. And that there was no real evidence that the officers of one academy had any more or less integrity than officers of another academy. So, but there was 2 key issues about those graduated penalties that had to be taken into consideration. See, at West Point Air Force Academy, no judgment really needed to be exercised. You either violated a code or you didn't. So if you crossed the line, you turn them in. Now at Navy, they would say this, look, in the real military, you'd never have an officer turn in another officer for lying to their spouse. That's private business. And you'd never punish somebody for lying to their spouse. So why are we going to throw somebody out of the Air Force Academy at West Point for lying to their girlfriend or boyfriend when they're on leave 2,000 miles away in Christmas about why they're breaking a date or something else? That's not what you do in the military. And what the Naval Coast Guard Merchant Academy emphasized is developing judgment and maturity. And the Air Force Academy in West Point, they had a code, except it really wasn't all that clear cut. And as an example, so a cadet was thrown out of the Air Force Academy for listening at a ski slope to instructions, that was 1967, without paying for it. But then in 1968, I think it was, a motel owner complained that 2 cadets that stayed in his motel had paid, but 2 cadets stayed who had not paid. So now the academy had to decide, was that a conduct violation, the 2 that didn't pay? Or was that an honor violation because it's stealing or cheating? Or is that an ethics violation? Well, arguably it's all 3. They decided it was an ethics violation. Okay, so I get thrown out if I listen to ski instructions without paying at a ski slope, but I don't get thrown out if I stay at a motel without paying. So even with the code, there was no end to possible inconsistencies or confusion. But I'm going to tell you what really got graduated penalties at West Point and the Air Force Academy, I think. There was a big cheating scandal at West Point in 1976. I had written a definitive work in this field, A Prayer for Relief. I was a civilian. I was summoned to West Point. I wound up representing, by contract, more than 120 cadets. There were 60 Army JAGs prosecuting cadets, 60 Army JAGs defending cadets. 400 to 600 were being investigated for collaborating on a daily take-home problems in a EE course. And I was elected, 26 years old, by the defense attorneys, and there was one civilian to be in charge of the defense. So I said, okay, you guys work on who's guilty and who's not. I'll work on a penalty. I met with Carl Albert, Speaker of the House of Representatives, and persuaded him to get 230-something U.S. congressmen to sign a petition I wrote to Secretary of the Army, Martin Hoffman, not to expel the cadets within 72 hours. And then Senator Sam Nunn, at a meeting I attended, persuaded West Point, he was head of the Senate Armed Services Committee, to expel the cadets for a year, or suspend them for a year, instead of permanently expel them. So over 120 left, and over 100 came back. And that was the first time in West Point's history somebody violated the honor code that got a penalty less than expulsion. Now, what justifies that? Well, the cadets had been told in writing that they were allowed during the entire fall semester of 1975 in EE to collaborate on their daily take-home problems, and they did. And then in the spring, at the beginning of the spring, they were told they could collaborate on their take-home problems, and they could, and they did. But in March, for some reason, the take-home problem said, do your own work. And the night before the class, conversations between roommates went like this. Glenn, as you know, I don't have a clue what to do in EE. You and I have been working together for a year and a semester and a half, as we've been permitted to do. And, this is do your own work. And I did my own work. Does that look right to you? Well, next door, same conversation. Roommate says, I think you left out the square root. Down the hall, somebody says, I don't have time to do this. Give me your paper and copies of verbatim. Well, they really cheated. According to West Point, that's all the same. And with over 400 being investigated and over 100 going to be thrown out, and it's daily press, the public wouldn't accept it. And I fully morally felt justified trying to get less than expulsion. If they had had graduated penalties, and West Point had thrown some out, but less some, nobody would have questioned their judgment. Nobody would have gone behind that, but you're going to throw them all out? Let me get this straight. You go through 3 years of West Point, and 20% of them had 1 or 2 years of college, and they're good enough to get to that point, but for that one thing, all of them are not good enough to be officers now, and that investment's down the drain, and they're going to suffer all these consequences. And oh, by the way, their commandant was removed, General Coster, for covering up the My Lai massacre. So when I've spent hundreds of hours talking to cadets about their thought process. And I can tell you, 1976, they didn't respect the honor code like now, like we did in the 60s. And I represented cadets here in 1984 in that cheating scandal. So I spent a week listening to them. And the superintendent suspended the honor code. It was so many violations, and gave 3 months for an amnesty. And I was demoralized because they were demoralized. They didn't respect the code like we did. So I wrote Congressman Les Aspin, chairman of the Harm Service Committee, a letter explaining why I thought these cheating scandals were happening. And that was a waste of time and a bridge too far, because all they did is send it back to the academy and it didn't really change anything. So I believe in graduated penalties. And we can debate whether in this case or that case what penalty is warranted, but to just blanketly say everybody's expelled, there's no gradations of seriousness, is, in my opinion, ridiculous and a violation of due process. Now, there was another issue, severity of the penalties. Well, the most severe penalty I ever found was Special Order number 1753, U.S. Air Force Academy, April 28, 1959. 9 months restriction, 225 tours at the Air Force Academy for, and I quote, possessing empty liquor bottle in room, unquote. So I asked, well, what authority do the academies have to, impose these penalties? There's nothing in statute about it, nothing in the Constitution about it. And the UCMJ, Uniform Code of Military Justice, when it was promulgated, it was a substitute for all the things that were existing at that time. And the only non-judicial punishment allowed, that is without a court-martial, was Article 15, and there were limits on the penalties, like you couldn't have restriction more than 60 days. So where do we get 6 months? Where do we get 9 months? Now, I concede this is an argument. This is not like a syllogism. The West Point regulations said you can't do X, they're doing X, they violated the law. But still, as a policy matter, I see no value in 9 months restrictions for something so minor, especially. But beyond that, I just think it violates due process. But, and then the 1970 Air Force Board of Visitors report said, quote, a cadet can function responsibly without a complex, completely arbitrary set of controls that govern his every thought and action during waking hours. Now, there's another concept in due process called substantive due process. That is, the rules have to be reasonable. They have to be rational. And you can debate what that is, but I found rules like this. West Point Air Force Academy had a regulation prohibiting, quoting, sitting in a parked car. And at Coast Guard Academy, fourth class, quote, fourth classmen may not discuss interclass or academy affairs outside the reservation, unquote. So I guess you can't tell your parents about the fourth class system, according to this. A court declared prohibiting people from being married at Merchant Marine Academy was unconstitutional. And the Air Force Academy prohibited entry to the academy if you'd ever been married, even if you're not married now. And then I found Air Force cadet was punished for kissing his girlfriend in Denver airport while wearing civilian clothes on leave out of uniform. So and then the honor code was applied to what arguably is trivia or minutia. Ask a roommate how to spell a word while writing a theme in your room. Taking a dime out of a phone booth, or if you're walking down the sidewalk, you see a dime, you put it in your pocket. Tolerating a tolerator, one person thrown out for that. Ski slopes, I mentioned that. The list goes on and on. What I'm saying, you match the penalty in its harshness or severity with the nature of the offense. And if you're going to expel somebody, I argue that that's different than just giving some confinements or something minor. That's the death penalty, so to speak, and that requires more from due process. Then there's procedural due process. Well, that means you got to have a fair hearing. And I just found this astonishing. At West Point, a cadet Hagopian was thrown out because at both West Point and the Naval Academy, you could be summarily dismissed from those academies for getting too many demerits or conduct offenses without any hearing. A federal court in the Hagopian case returned a cadet to West Point, pointing out that almost all the demerits was given by one person, equivalent to our AOC. And that person reviewed the appeal, and then there's no hearing. So is anybody, you don't raise your hand, but has anybody ever known anybody that had an AOC that they thought didn't like them? So I'm just saying, if you want to have a fair hearing, which you have to do in the real military anyway, you need to have the accused present while the witnesses testify, where the evidence is presented, notice of what the charges are, and be given enough time and means to have a meaningful defense. And so, no notice was given to the people pulled out of bed in the middle of the night. They were told to go to an important meeting and weren't told what it was for. So I'm just saying, this is why I wrote it at the time. I'm not saying this happens now, but it happened then, and it's just irrefutable. So, at the Merchant Marine Academy, and I quote, at some officers are not even aware when a cadet honor hearing is in progress at the Merchant Marine Academy, so they don't even bother to tell them. So, in 1972, I went over that. At West Point, 3 West Point cadets were charged one evening, adjudicated honor code violators by a cadet subcommittee and by a full honor board that same night, and processed out as voluntary resignees the next morning. So this is another overnight thing. Now, appeals. I want to talk about that for a moment. The academies, by regulation, allowed repeals to honor board hearings. Not conduct offenses at West Point, but in Naval Academy. But they pressured people not to appeal. And the law requires that an individual not be coerced into waiving his or her right to appeal through a threat of greater punishment. That's constitutional law. So what happened at the Air Force Academy, the legal officers advised the cadet convicted that if he appeals, the superintendent may court-martial him and maybe get an honorable discharge, maybe be prison. Is there any surprise? There's not many appeals. At West Point and the Air Force Academy, cadets were threatened with court-martial, prison, and other penalties if they sought appeal. And then at West Point, cadets were told, well, if you resign without appealing, no notation of your honor code violation will be on your record. But if you appeal, it will be on your records. And then there's isolation. The isolation process during an appeal, cadets would have to wait at West Point 3 weeks minimum for an appeal board, during which time, or longer, he might have to be in solitary confinement as he had spent the past 1.5 days. So as a result of 150 West Point Honor Code convictions during July 67 through January 72, only 9 appealed out of 150. Of 466 cadets at the Air Force Academy during July 59 through December 71, only 9 appealed. At both academies, only 2 cases were reversed. And in February 68, only 1 West Point cadet appealed over in a 3.5-year period, and only 1 Naval Academy midshipman had appealed in 5 years. And I maintain they must have a right to appeal, particularly if the honor hearing was faulty to begin with, or you had one officer given all the demerits, or most of the demerits. You have a right to appeal, and it's got to be a fair hearing before you expel them. vagueness. Now, the concept of a due process requires that whatever is prohibited be reasonably clear, so you know what not to do. And then I found all these conduct regulations like carelessness. Now you're going to get demerits for carelessness, indifference of any kind. Anybody guilty of that here? General inattention. Anybody guilty of general inattention? Lacking judgment, extremely poor judgment, gross lack of judgment, conduct reflecting poor judgment, gross, unsatisfactory conduct trends, and improper not public conduct. Those are all prescriptions for which you could get demerits at West Point or the Air Force Academy. And I don't think we have any idea what we have to do to not violate that. Now, let's take the ethics committees, Coast Guard Academy and Air Force Academy. There's no rules. It's whatever the ethics committee decides a violation was. And of course, it could be inconsistent from one committee to another. But there were confusion. Again, because of vagueness. And look, this is inherent. I'm not saying anybody's evil here. I'm just saying this was an inherent problem. And you got down to, okay, the 2 cadets didn't pay to stay at the motel. Is that honor, is that conduct, or is that ethics? Now, I'm going to quickly go through 10 lessons learned that I think are still applicable. First of all, there is a duty to obey the law. It is not optionable. Now, sometimes we can debate what the law is, but sometimes it's not debatable. I don't think that silence was debatable. I don't think confrontation is debatable. Now, the academies might say, well, if you appeal, then you got your hearing and that cures any defect on the lower. Look, at an academy, it matters what your peers say in the honor. That matters a lot, and so much that I think it has to be fair there. And so the academies have to obey regulations, even with discretionary decisions. They cannot take the law in their own hands. Number 2, the law is your friend. It was a good purpose. These are the rules of engagement. These rules have developed over time through Congress, through courts, and they're there for a purpose. And a lot of people that in the military deride them like they're legalisms and technicalities that let guilty people off the hook. I submit it's the opposite. These are the rules of engagement. Now, my favorite movie is Top Gun. And I remember Tom Cruise, Maverick, being chewed out because maybe he got Viper, but he went below the hard deck of 10,000 feet and it didn't count. And he said, Lieutenant Mitchell, the rules of engagement exist for your protection, and they're not flexible, and nor am I. You know, if you're out here on the Friends of Friendly Strife playing your athletic contest, you got to obey the rules. And if you score a touchdown but you violate the rules, it doesn't count. Well, it's the same thing with these legal requirements, that these are the rules of engagement. You have to apply them in the military, so they should learn to apply them at the academy, and for the protection of the accused, but also the academy itself, because if you don't, you know, you might get sued. And also it would be perceived unfairness if people feel like they're being railroaded. And then they become cynical, and then people know about the perceived unfairness. So for all these reasons, these rules need to be applied. Number 3, cadets do not own the honor code. Let me repeat that. Cadets do not own the honor code. They've never owned the honor code. It's not a separate jurisdiction. They're part of the United States government. They're part of the Constitution and the statutes. And to say they're a separate jurisdiction and they got an unofficial system is not only wrong, it's absurd. And it's the wrong thing to teach them. Should be teaching them, look, we don't let you fly gliders without teaching you how to do it. And in fact, we don't let you do anything here without teaching you how to do it. And we're not going to let you have an honor hearing without teaching you how to do it and the way you got to do it in real life. And if you're up front with the cadets, instead of telling them, of course you want them to buy into it, of course you want them to obey it, of course you want them to, but I'm submitting that this stuff about a separate jurisdiction and unofficial standards and all that is just ridiculous and it's wrong. And I wrote, the training benefits the cadets believing their codes belong to them More efficient enforcement and enhancement acceptance of its principles need not be lost if the cadets are taught the value and necessity of active legal supervision of adjudicatory procedures. I also wrote, Academy officials would no longer feel reluctant to curb specific abuses such as silence, since the pretense of complete cadet control would be recognized as an unneeded fiction. By the way, the cadets did not start the honor code at the Air Force Academy. It was part of the West Point package that came here. Now, they were presented it, and they voted for it, but I'm just saying, I came in thinking that we created it. We cadets created it, and it's just not true. And even at West Point, it wasn't official until MacArthur created it in 1923. It was called the Vigilance Committee up until 1923, and it was, quote, unofficial. He made it official in 1923, and the other academies didn't have it until after 1923. Number 4, the Honor Code is not the only valid model. Navy, Coast Guard, Merchant Marine academies have an honor concept. They have graduated penalties. They don't have a toleration clause as a substantive offense. Now, I know all the arguments of why we should have the honor code, and I actually was for the graduated penalties, which we now have. But this notion that I've heard it articulated, Air Force Academy graduates have more integrity than Naval Academy graduates. There's no evidence of that. Somehow the fleet functions, and also there's ROTC and other training programs. So I'm just saying, if you want to have this honor code the way it is, fine, but don't think that it's like part of the 10 Commandments that are, and there's no other way to do it. Number 5, harsher is not always better. And there's no rush to have honor hearings in the middle of the night. Your hearing is at 2 a.m., you go to it. 4 a.m., you go to it. There's no reason to give 225 tours for an empty liquor bottle in a room. Now, you can debate where to draw the line, but I'm just saying there's limits. And I get back to, if non-judicial punishment is limited to 60 days restriction, where do we get 180 days? Number 6, and this is one of the 2 most important of all. Intense, close supervision is required of the conduct honor systems. We don't have an ethics system here. I don't know whether Coast Guard or not. Because the Academy adjudicatory systems, I call them all adjudications. They're adjudicatory systems. That's the primary vehicle through which a cadet learns how to administer military justice. And they're going to mirror what they see, what they hear from the officers, what the officers tell them. And if the officers have a laissez-faire position, like I've read to you some did, and we're not to interfere, then they're not going to learn how to do it correctly. Now, I told my brother here in a van as I was driving years ago how we as cadets used to sleep on a bedroll, not in the bed, to save time, not realizing that I had 3 very young grandchildren in the back listening. And a week later, Vivian, my wife, babysitting, put the boy to bed, and he pulls out a bedroll from underneath the bed and puts it on the bed. And she said, well, what are you doing? And she said, Papa does it. And then she goes over to the girl, and she goes into a closet and pulls out a bedroll and puts it on top of the bed. She said, what are you doing? Papa does it. We got this figured out. Now, my point here is, thinking back, I absorbed as a cadet what the officers said, what they did. They were like God. They had all this power. So the officers need to think they're going to mirror. They're going to listen to what you say. They're going to do what you say. And you better get it right and live up to what you expect from the cadets, because if you don't, they're going to see it as hypocritical, or they're going to be cynical. And I'll go so far as to submit that nobody's perfect and nothing's perfect, and it's impossible to live up to it. And I'm going to give a couple examples. There's somebody in this room that was in a judo class with me my senior year. In the last 2 hours of the class, 2 cadets at a time were being graded. So the rest of us were in a separate room sleeping, and the light was out. And somebody walks in and says, a congressman is coming to tour. He's going to be here in 30 minutes. We want a lot of activity when they arrive. So we went back to sleep. Somebody came in and said, the congressman's right outside. And we got up, we turned the light on. In the next 5 minutes, that congressman there was more activity than the previous 8 classes. There were more key eyes, throwing people around the room and all this stuff. And then the congressman left, and we went back to sleep. But I thought to myself, didn't we just mislead that congressman? Didn't we just give the wrong impression? Were we lying? And this happens at West Point at the time. Somebody applies for a Rhodes Scholarship, they write a theme, and then an officer board changes the essays to submit. And there's evidence in the perfectly that happened in the Air Force Academy. So, okay, once you start writing your theme in your room, if you get any help from somebody, you cheated, you can be thrown out on the honor code. But if I'm going to submit a Rhodes Scholarship application, then a bunch of officers can help me rewrite it. And I'm not expressing an opinion one way or the other about what the meaning of that is, except one thing. If you go by a code and you teach cadets it's absolute, and you don't teach judgment, and there aren't gradations, then they're going to pick up these discrepancies. And there's plenty of evidence of, let's say, cynicism and disillusionment as a result. Okay, now the last, Fred Malmstrom, class 64, wrote a 3-page part series about the honor code, the history of the honor code, in checkpoints. That was in 2005. And he makes a good point. He says, no commandant in his right mind would permit a military training system to run heedlessly amok. The fourth class system will collapse with hazing abuses if it weren't constantly monitored. And so will prisoner abuse at Abu Ghraib. So we monitor so that's why they got to monitor these adjudicatory systems and the cadet honor code. Now, I'm just going to say, officers, I've talked about, have to live up to what they teach. And when you have responses in the press denying that such and such really occurred at the academy, and then cadets believe that it really did occur, then they're back to, hey, they're not being truthful. And I can give examples of this. But I first noticed with General Rosa, the superintendent, that he was sent out here and there was bad publicity about sex harassment, discrimination. He started admitting things instead of denying it. If anything, he over-admitted. Once the person in charge admits we got a problem and we're going to fix it, there's really not much else to argue about. But if you deny it, and it's not really plausible, the denial, then you're going to keep getting pushback. So, and then let me say, so you admit errors, pledge to fix them, and don't deny them. It's not just whether you believe it's true. I'm just saying if people out there believe what you're denying isn't true, then it's going to cause a problem. Now, Superintendent of the Air Force Academy, when opposing the honor summaries being released, said in his affidavit, the inability of the public to understand properly the honor cadet honor system, that's one of the reasons the Academy officials gave for denying the documents. And a West Point talking paper about the honor code, 1972, March says, we should all recognize it's unreasonable to expect information leaked outside of the Corps to be fairly or accurately reported. This is simply because it's impossible for anyone but us to understand the honor code and system completely. Ladies and gentlemen, that's the wrong attitude. The people own the code in the Air Force Academy. They pay for it. They created the legislation. And my belief is that most of some of this couldn't survive public scrutiny like the silence or the all-night interrogation. But now you got web guy. Now you got every day it's out. You used to send your son in the early 60s here, and they'd come in July and he'd come back in, say, May, and nobody knew a family didn't know what happened. They didn't see him over Christmas. Now everything's displayed. And so now the final thing is, I would say being open-minded to change. And Douglas MacArthur wrote because he got a lot of resistance to changing things at West Point. And I quote, "Conceit, sentiment, and blind worship have sustained outmoded offshoots of tradition too long. Academy graduates think that any change is a lessening of their standards, cheapening of their value of being an Academy graduate. But I concluded that the role of the academies, of tradition at the academies, can best be described as the practices of the past dictating the practice of the future merely because they were the practices of the past. And so need to be an open-minded. In conclusion, I want to tell you that I saw an email once quoting a philosopher saying that dissent is the highest form of patriotism. I don't agree with that. I think making the system work is the highest form of patriotism. So we have to have the military, we have to have good leaders, we need to train them in their officer training systems, especially at the academies. And I will tell you this. I stood up before our South Carolina Senate 3 times. And I think I was respected there. But I said, I know you know I got a problem here, and I'm going to tell you what it is. During my formative development stages at the Air Force Academy, as a teenager, I went to the Air Force Academy. And inscribed in my class ring, and I'd hold it up, is our class motto, Esse non videre. Esse non videre means to be, not to seem, to be, not to seem. My problem is, ever since I got in the legislature, first 2 years there was an FBI sting, 20% were in jail within 2 years. Ever since I got here in the legislature, it's that the motto were the opposite, to seem, not to be. It's a 180-degree culture clash. See, in the Air Force, it's very concrete. You either had enough fuel to go home, you didn't. You dropped the bomb the right place at the right time, and it went out the right time, or it didn't. Here in the legislature, we say, you see that black wall over there? It's really not a wall. It just looks like one. And even if it were a wall, it's not black. It just looks black. So everything is an obfuscation, a distortion, an exaggeration, a quibble, or a downright lie. And I hear it daily, and it's like taking a fork and scraping across the blackboard. So it's very functional, this training here, in terms of being very sensitive to that. But at the same time, it was hard. I want to thank certain people. I want to thank Colonel Mark Anarimo and the CCLD. I want to thank Marty Marcolongo and the AOG. And I want to thank Bill Preston, who's not here, but he'll be here tomorrow. And I want to thank my wife, Vivian, in particular. Without them, this would not happen. What I'm leaving you with, in my mind, I was at the right place at the right time to, if I did not get this published, and furthermore, if it were not publicized, then it would not change. So I researched and wrote this for what I considered to be a noble purpose of improving the system. So I'm going to stop talking now, and then I'll answer any questions that you may have.
Mike, first of all, thanks for what you said, but would you take a second and explain to our group how your publication of A Prayer for Relief was received by the Air Force and by the Air Force JAG Corps when it was published?
Well, I will. About a week after A Prayer for Relief was published, I got a call from 60 Minutes asking me to be on 60 Minutes. I swear I never heard of 60 Minutes. I was focused on completing this project. So I left on Sunday night. I watched at a motel 60 Minutes to see the format. Next morning, I was in my captain's uniform. I was filmed at McGuire Air Force Base, and a 60 Minutes piece came out in June of 1974. And now every general in the Pentagon is seeing this. And it led to, just to show you how well received it was, at Harvard Business School, I did 2 things. Number one, there's a course called Power and Influence, in which the students, I took the course my second year, the students study how people have acquired certain people power and influence. So they study General Patton one day, Mary Kay one day. While I'm in the class of 90 studies Mike Rose. So I'm 33 years old, and they show this 60 Minutes film, and they discuss what I did and what with my law practice as of age 33. I also got a case in organizational behavior written more than 100 pages long about the West Point cheating scandal and how the superintendent handled it. One of the first things he did is write to every living graduate saying there's no problem, it's exaggerated. And it turns out there was a big problem and it wasn't exaggerated. But anyway, I lost 2 jobs in the Air Force. And the first one, look, from the Air Force standpoint, I'm on a leave of absence, paying my own way to law school, they're not paying, and now I'm investigating them, and now I'm suing them, and now I'm publishing this. Department of Defense General Counsel's office calls me up and says, this is great, we're going to send it to each academy, thank you for doing it, have them respond. But it was an inherent criticism of West Point and the Air Force Academy. So even though I'd been a legal officer for a year and a half at McGuire, and I got top OERs, I was not a JAG. And I got an honorable discharge and I left. And you know what? Probably if I was Judge Advocate General, I wouldn't have made me a JAG either. I mean, it just got so polarized that it just wasn't functional. Now, the other job I lost, it was an OER said I was against the Air Force Academy's honor code. And I wound up getting that, yeah, that's my ID card, so I'm retired, okay? But beyond that, and this is almost too complicated to explain, but I wound up being the subject of a front page article in the Sunday New York Times and Washington Post involving Chief Justice Burger. And in the law section of Time magazine that week, the law section was on Justice Burger and me with our pictures side by side. So I moved to Colorado, and I was admitted to the California and Pennsylvania bar, and I took the Colorado bar exam, and then I was notified that I was accused of misleading people into thinking I was licensed in Colorado. And an Air Force Colonel, JAG, at Lowry had signed an affidavit saying I had given him the impression that I was a license in Colorado while I was waiting for the bar exam result. Well, I talked to the colonel about a military matter, so I didn't need to be licensed in Colorado. So why would I tell him that? And my business card said licensed in Pennsylvania and California. So in other words, it wasn't true. But after the investigation, I got a letter saying I was not admitted to the Colorado bar. And 5 people voted against it, and the 1 person investigator voted for me. So now I'm unemployable, and I'm not admitted to the Colorado bar. This would be like somebody investigating an honor offense, and then later, you, a cadet, get in the mail a letter saying, you violated the honor code, you're out of here. So I moved to Minnesota. Minnesota admitted me to their bar. So now I'm in California, Minnesota, Pennsylvania, and they looked at what happened to Colorado, and they said that, anyway, they admitted me. And then I got admitted in 1981 in Colorado. And then later I applied to the Supreme Court of the United States Bar. And I was told, and on the application, it did not ask anything about whether I'd been not admitted to a bar. But since I had been accused of lack of candor, I volunteered it. I want you to know I'm in the Colorado bar now, but I was denied for 2 or 3 years. And then in 1986, Associated Press called me and said, what do you think of Justice Burger's dissent? And I had no idea what we were talking about. So I got admitted to the Supreme Court bar. Justice Burger wrote a dissent, and Justice O'Connor went along with it. So now I'm marked as, and they based it on the Colorado stuff, which Colorado stuff had already forgiven. I never got charged with anything. I never had a hearing about anything. The 1 person who investigated voted for me. So I got Justice Burger to reverse himself. And I'm going to tell you how I did it. I went to every lawyer in the United States that you've ever heard of, F. Lee Bailey, famous people, and they all said, you're right, but you're not going to be able to get Burger to change his mind. So I went to the Library of Congress, and I found in a little book and a footnote that Aaron Griswold had, in the 1970s, been given a award at the U.S. Supreme Court for having argued more cases for the Supreme Court than any living person. I met with him, and he represented me. And I came out to Colorado, and I got that investigator who voted for my admission was then a circuit court judge. His name's Roger Cisneros. He signed an affidavit saying, yeah, I investigated Rose. He didn't do anything wrong. And the other people voted against him, in my opinion, because they thought he was a radical, and that's all they needed to know. That's what it said. So what I did, this was my idea. I resigned from the Supreme Court and reapplied. And the dean of NYU Law School was one of the two people who recommended me. Aaron Griswold was one of the people who recommended me. Anticipating this might come up, I brought this. This is Aaron Griswold, dean of Harvard Law School, 26 years. Solicitor General of the United States, 13 years. This is autobiography. He devotes 4 pages to me in his autobiography. And I came up with, he said, I said, look, I'm going to resign, I'm going to reapply. So Griswold recommended me. He dictated a 4-page letter, and dean of NYU Law School, and this time Berger voted, and O'Connor to admit me. So I look at this as weaponizing the bar admissions process. I was astounded that the judges had so much latitude. They might overturn some hearing or some agency or something, but they could do what they did. I had no charges, I had no hearing, and one person investigated. I had a card. Why would I tell some colonel that I was licensed, give them the impression I'm licensed in Colorado when I didn't need to be? I'm talking about a military matter. It doesn't matter where you license, and my cards. So anyway, I thank my wife in particular because she lived through this for a couple of years. And my attitude is I couldn't live with this. In fact, Griswold wrote me a letter and said, I've heard all this. You already admitted to the Supreme Court. So why worry about it? And I wrote him a 4-page letter telling him why I couldn't live with it. So I see this as I have listened to hundreds of cadets and midshipmen tell their story. I've often said, I wish I was advising the academy to help to help them instead of being an adversary. And so I never imagined that we would come to this point here where I could explain my side of the story, what this is about, what I did, why I did it, and why it mattered. And so, you know, I'm retired in the Air Force, and but I took what I consider a bum rap. Except I will say, look, once the publicity started, New York Times, Washington Post. First of all, I was good at it, and secondly, looking back, I wish I hadn't maybe said this or that. Except it's like one of the lawyers here said, well, okay, why do you call it prayer for relief? Isn't that a little harsh? No, actually, with these things I've described today, they weren't going to change. They weren't changeable because of the ideology or the mindset. If you really believe the Cadet Honor Committee is a separate jury, so we've been through all this. So it was only publication, and once it got going, I was on a track, and of course that alienated a lot of people. Jack Brush over there, who was a professor, wrote for a publication, AOG magazine, which they refused to publish, an article entitled, Do We Have Our Own Billy Mitchell? And, but that was way back in the 70s when all this controversy was ensuing. So I will say this in conclusion. At this stage of my life, I look back and say, you know, I can actually point to some things that got done that I think have lasting meaning, like the redaction in the Freedom of Information Act case, that precedent, or getting rid of the silence, or graduated penalties, and some of the other things we went over. And even, I've testified twice before the House Armed Services Committee about the West Point cheating scandal. And I want to tell you how we forced graduated penalties in that West Point cheating scandal. I kept hearing about massive honor code violations, and it was demoralizing. It's not like we're the exception and we've never done it before. So what I did is I got the lawyers to write affidavits detailing with their clients all the honor code violations they could know, dates, times, places, everything. We took the affidavits and put them in a safe, and the Catholic priest, Father Curley, was the only person that knew how to get to him. That was the only person the cadets trusted. I didn't want him to trust me. And then I said, now I want you to go around West Point, and every third word out of your mouth is affidavit. Affidavit, affidavit, affidavit. We never intended to release the affidavits. We never said we were going to release the affidavits. We just said they existed. So next thing you know, Secretary of the Army, Martin Hoffman, paid my way to come see him. And I'm in a big room, table full of generals, and every third word out of their mouth is affidavit. And then Sam Nunn, then I told you, Speaker of the House of Representatives got the people to sign the petition, and then Sam Nunn got the 1 year suspension. And both sides didn't like it. And lawyers know when you got two people arguing that both sides don't like it, it's probably pretty good. But here's what I want to tell you. We never intended to release these affidavits. And Father Curley was so upset that they got suspension, completely without authority, completely contrary to what he represented. He released them and gave them to the New York Times. And now the Academy's got to go through honor hearings about all of this. So it was just sad. It was lose, lose, lose pretty much all the way around, but I think if you had graduated penalties, that would have avoided a lot of this. So I feel that I've contributed to my country in these manners in a unique way. And now, look, there's our 50th reunion's coming up, and I know a doctor there will tell you, yeah, Mike, you got money for hundreds of us doctors. The military promised them money, then didn't pay it. I took them to the Board of Correctional Military Records, they got money. I never took a case in the military that I didn't think was morally right in addition to legally right. I'm not interested in helping somebody get out of their commitment, for example, for the sake of doing it. Another question.
Mike, I met Mike because having taken a bunch of law here, I heard from the law department all the horrific things about Mike Rose. And I think I was sitting alert at Charleston in a 106. And one day I just called. Said, I want to come meet you. I'm Greg. And I went and met him. And I was enthralled. Here's a man who had stood up to do the right thing as a grad and took massive, he was reviled by most of us. Marty may remember this from his time. He's a kid. He was reviled. And that's all you heard. But it wasn't the man I met. So the point is, be very careful about listening to people in authority tell you about someone who is reviled. There may come a time when you want to ask the question. And I'm honored to have known you and the things you've done with Terry Chevalier and others, and with those of us who might not have gotten retirement medical health care. You did that. Nobody would give a diddly dang. I care, and I'm grateful for you, Mike.
Well, thank you. Let me add this, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, Tom, in answer to your question, yeah, the AOG considered whether to throw me out at one point. And further, the superintendent then of the Academy published his farewell article in which he denounced me. He said, the law of the article is inaccurate. In fact, I got the article here, and poor law. And nobody but his NYU professor, to my knowledge, thinks that it's good law. Well, first of all, no NYU law professor or any law professor ever read, to my knowledge, Prayer for Relief. This was a student publication. So here he is telling people that, referencing somebody that doesn't exist. And I applaud him if he read all nearly 200 pages and 1,100 footnotes to determine in his mind that it was all inaccurate. But to this day, I've invited people to point out anything that's inaccurate, and nothing's been pointed out. So what happened is 4 Academy grads and I published a letter to the editor, the AOG did publish it, rebutting it and pointing out this stuff. And how, the Department of Defense General Counsel's office called and said it was great. But now the superintendent says it's inaccurate facts and poor law and refers to a non-existent NYU law professor. Of those 5, 1 was a Rhodes Scholar class 70, 1 was number 1 as class 73, and 4 of the 5 were lawyers or law students. So these are people of stature. Let me tell you what happened. This academy taught us to think, critical thinking. And I don't really consider any Oxford station here to have any more authority to gauge or evaluate what's going on here than those of us who've lived through it and graduated from here. So I carefully questioned all sides, and I reached my conclusions. And my conclusion is this stuff's got to stop. It's not going to stop unless it's documented, unless it's published, and that was my motivation. Another question. Yes, sir.
I'm just kind of curious because everything you've described is really about changing people's habits, sort of their resting assumptions about the way things ought to be. If you were to characterize where you got the greatest resistance and greatest acceptance, is there any way you can categorize that in terms of position, age? You know, who was your?
Oh,
yeah.
I can answer that.
Okay.
The greatest resistance by far were the people who ran the academy. Now, particularly the law department. Now think about this. All these generals are looking at 60 Minutes and they're saying, what's all the ruckus and all this stuff, and how come you let this guy go to law school? And it all comes back to the head of the law department. And he's a West Point graduate. He's very respected, but this stuff happened on his watch. And if you got the ideology that cadets own the code and they can do whatever they want, basically, I mean, you can't shoot people, but they just let them, we've been through all that. So what I'm saying is the more responsibility an officer had, the higher up, the more resistant they were. And because it was a reflection, they believed on them. But not just that, the culture. Like General Clark, the superintendent, was a POW. He's been through a lot. He's done a lot for our country. And he's writing in his article about the culture change. And so these are my words, not him. He doesn't like hippies. He doesn't like long hair. He doesn't like people against the war. And I was seen, I went to NYU. I'm in the Northeast. I'm around hippies, and call it whatever you want. So I was unpatriotic, bit the hand that fed me and all this stuff, but they were defensive and not open-minded, and I saw it as an institutional thing. This has got nothing to do with, I mean, look, I'm at a family gathering, somebody says, well, Mike, what do you think of tattoos? And I said, well, I think they're decadent myself. The lady next to me's got a tattoo, and now she won't talk to me. So I'm just saying, we all got our lines that you won't cross. But it was the academy. But what happened is we had civilian control. General Rosie was sent out here to change things. You might not like to change, but they didn't like what MacArthur was changing either. And if you read these articles about West Point back in the 1870s and the 1840s, about every 20, 30 years they got new regulations and a new way of doing things. So people thought it was but also graduates. I mean, they're out flying planes or whatever they're doing. They just didn't know this stuff or care about this stuff. So but anyway, the biggest resistance were the people running the academies. And I understand that. So I just see myself as having made that sacrifice. You know, I'm sorry you're discomforted, but you need to face this. Next question. Yes, sir.
With all these critiques of the way the system was improperly done. How do you, are you aware of how the system is now run at the Air Force Academy, and would you have advice for like our honor folks?
Well, yes and no. I sat down with Lieutenant Colonel Fast, okay, and we discussed some things for, I don't know, maybe an hour. But I really had the impression that there's officer supervision that's proactive, which is a big turning point in a positive direction. I have no idea at the other academies how they're operating, except I think Navy, Coast Guard, Merchant Marine Academy still have an honor concept. But, I'm very aware you have graduated penalties and some of the rehabilitation things, and we got a different culture than we had. I mean, when I was an Eagle Scout and I was a bunch of things, and I didn't really need a whole bunch of training about honor, and I don't think my classmates did either, because we are already not lying, cheating, and stealing. No, and I view myself, as I told Lieutenant Colonel Fast, I am an expert, I believe, on how things operated in the 60s and 70s. I'm not an expert on how they operate now. But I consider myself, view me as an asset. If anybody wants to discuss anything, then I'm happy to do it. If anybody wants a copy of Prayer for Relief, it's not in print anymore. I only have 2 copies. To make it hardback, I had to pay about $100 each. But I have it on a PDF. So if you ask me to send it to you, I'll email it to you.
So we'll probably put this presentation in video form on the CCLD website. And with your permission, Mr. Rose will also put that PDF on the website along
All right.
with the presentation. So it'll be available for download for everybody.
And there's at least 2 law review articles have been written about my law review article.
Okay. Yeah, we'll hang all that together on the CCLD website. I'm looking at Julie Monica, because she just got 3 tasks in one sentence. But sir, I would like to, unless somebody has a burning question that can't wait till either before tomorrow's event or while we're walking around, I'd like to take this opportunity to conclude the event.
Yep.
And to thank you again, Mr. Rose, for sharing this. It's extremely important and very timely.
Thank you.